What would you do if the man who abandoned you before you were even born was now sitting across from you in a luxury restaurant, sipping $1,000 wine, completely unaware that you're his daughter? She didn't come for revenge. She didn't come to beg. She came with nothing but truth, and a question he couldn't escape. Do you remember my mother? Tonight, in a world of silk suits, crystal glasses, and elite power, one moment will rewrite everything. Before we begin this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe that the truth always finds its way, don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this, you won't want to miss what happens next. A white ribbon, a pair of clear eyes, a carefully folded piece of paper is placed between two strangers in a restaurant where surprises don't belong. And 4 words, "You're my dad," spoken by an 8-year-old girl, soft enough to go unnoticed by the next table, yet heavy enough to collapse the entire world a millionaire had spent his life building on power, precision, and emotional distance. What would you do if both your past and your future were staring at you from across the table, not with anger or fear, but with the quiet certainty of a child offering you a second chance? Not bought, not bargained for, just given. Have you ever believed that a single encounter, unscheduled, unplanned, could teach someone who controls empires how to simply breathe again? And more importantly, if that child carried your name, but you never even knew she existed for nearly a decade, would you walk away or walk toward her? Tell us, what city are you watching this from? Have you ever had a life-shifting moment like this? Drop a comment below, because sometimes one small detail is the beginning of everything. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She didn't look around for help. She looked straight at him, as if she had crossed a city full of strangers just to say one thing he wasn't ready to hear. And in that moment, time didn't slow down. It stopped. The fork froze in midair. The chatter around him faded into silence. The chandelier's warm glow turned cold, because sometimes it's not the noise that shatters a man. It's the stillness that follows a truth too powerful to ignore. Who was she? How did she find him? And why now, on the one night he thought he was truly alone? If you're still here, you're meant to hear this story. And what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about success, regret, and the kind of love that shows up when you least deserve it, but need it the most. 4 words that changed everything. You're my dad. Sometimes, what changes a life isn't an accident, a scandal, or even a failure, but a single sentence, short enough to slip past most ears, yet sharp enough to pierce straight through the heart of the one meant to hear it. For Ethan Maddox, the moment that little girl stood at his dinner table, inside orchid and slate, a rooftop restaurant nestled atop a glass tower in the heart of San Francisco, everything he had meticulously built seemed to fall into a sudden, soundless vacuum. The clinking of cutlery, the background violin, the murmurs of nearby dinners, all vanished. The girl, 8 years old, with gently curled hair tied in a white ribbon and eyes that sparkled like mirrored glass, did not look out of place. She stood still, unwavering, as if her entire life had led her here. Ethan, a man who once stood before an international board of shareholders without blinking, could only stammer 3 words. "I'm sorry." "What?" No one noticed immediately, but a few heads began to turn. Some recognized him, the CEO of Maddox Innovations, The man who had just graced the cover of Fortune magazine with a headline as cold as it was commanding. The man who owns America's digital future. And now, that same man was facing something no algorithm could have predicted. A child calling him father. The girl didn't blink, didn't tremble, didn't hesitate. She stood with the calm of someone who had rehearsed these exact 4 words. For this exact moment. Ethan didn't believe it. Not right away. He assumed it was a mistake. Perhaps a cruel tabloid stunt. Or a desperate mother's ploy to bait him into a scandal. But her eyes made him pause. There was no panic in them, no manipulation, just something he couldn't decode. Trust. And that was the reason he didn't reach for his phone to call security, like he had in countless other unpredictable situations. She knew his name. She knew where he would be. She wasn't lost. She wasn't looking for her mom. She was here. For him. Ethan's hand clenched. He set down his silverware on the white porcelain plate, leaned back slowly, as if to create space between himself and a reality slipping rapidly out of his control. He looked closer. A simple white dress, slightly worn sneakers, a small lavender backpack, and a flower-shaped pendant necklace he swore he'd seen before. Maybe on a night in December years ago when he'd given it to a woman in a Chicago apartment. Number impossible. Ethan shook his head, but a girl had already taken the seat across from him, calm, polite, as if she had a reservation. He meant to say something, ask her name, who she was with, but she spoke first, her voice soft, yet firm. "My name is Sophie. My mom's name was Claire Monroe." That name, Claire, buried under contracts, board meetings, and endless work hours. Claire, with a tilted smile, warm brown eyes, and a laugh that made Chicago winters bearable. They only saw each other for a few months. Never called it love. I never even officially ended it. He had simply vanished, summoned back to headquarters for the largest IPO in company history. He thought he'd call. He never did. And now, a girl with Claire's eyes and a face that mirrored his own sat across from him, saying things that needed no DNA test. "Mom passed away," Sophie said, like someone who had endured many nights without comfort. 2 weeks ago. Ethan didn't react in time. His hand was on the table, but his fingers refused to move. "I found the papers in Mom's old letterbox. Your name was there, your company's name, and photos." She pulled a neatly folded document from her backpack and placed it before him. Like a contract. Ethan didn't touch it, just stared. Across the top, paternity acknowledgement form. Below, his Claire's signature, and his, a lab-issued copy, dated 8 years ago. Ethan couldn't remember, but he couldn't deny it. His body was in the present. His mind was lost in the past. And for the first time, his heart refused to follow orders. It felt as if someone had shattered the emotional firewall he'd built all his life. He didn't rush to open the paper. His mind was spinning, like the room itself had begun to rotate, each layer of time peeling back, one by one, toward a place he had buried under the guise of being busy. Claire Monroe. He never imagined her name could awaken a feeling he thought he'd left behind on a runway at O'Hare years ago. And now, a single sheet of paper, a bold name, and a signature he couldn't remember signing, was unraveling his life like a contract he was never consulted on. Sophie remained still. She didn't bite her lip, didn't lower her eyes. She didn't beg. She simply waited, as if she knew he would read it. And when Ethan finally reached for the document, the chill down his spine wasn't from what he saw. It was from what he couldn't deny. His name was there, clear, beneath Father, beneath Claire's signature. Beside it, the undersigned confirms paternity. He remembered once that Claire had asked, "If you ever had a child, what would you name it?" He'd laughed. Probably wouldn't. Claire didn't laugh back. Now he understood why. He'd never given her the chance to ask again. One missed call, one flight back to San Francisco, one promise buried under a mountain of urgent emails. And now, in front of him, a child with no demands, no lawsuits, only one truth that rendered all his power meaningless. She existed. "Mom said you weren't bad, just busy." No malice in her tone, but it echoed like a mirror reflecting everything he didn't want to see. Himself. Ethan swallowed. For the first time his throat was dry, and he had no boardroom speech to blame. He opened his mouth to ask something, anything, but she beat him to it. "I didn't come here for money. I don't need anyone to raise me. I just need to know, am I your daughter?" Ethan didn't know how to respond. How could he deny it, with the proof staring at him, and a face that mirrored his own, softer, purer? But how could he confirm it, when his entire world had no room for the unexpected, especially not a child with Claire's hair and eyes that made even corporate towers feel small? Just then, the waiter arrived, courteous, unaware, carrying the glass of red wine Ethan had ordered earlier. Ethan raised his hand and said nothing, but his gaze said it all. Not now. Sophie looked at the glass, then back at him. "Mom didn't drink. She said it made people remember wrong." Ethan let out a faint laugh, not because it was funny, because it was painfully true. "I don't remember everything," he said slowly, "but I remember your mom was the only person who could make things feel okay without even trying." Sophie nodded. Her gaze softened, just slightly, a softness Ethan had never seen in any deal. He picked up the paper, folded it gently, slipped it into the breast pocket of his suit, an act that, for Sophie, was the clearest answer she had hoped for. "Where have you been these past 2 weeks?" he asked, voice lower now, no longer guarded. "With a neighbor. She's nice, but said she can't keep me long. Her house is small. Her kids are many." A strange pressure clenched in his chest, part rage at himself, part disbelief. How had this child lived for 8 years in the same city as him, and he had no idea? A CEO with a global intelligence team, yet unaware he had a daughter in his own backyard. Ethan took a deep breath. "Would you like to stay with me tonight?" The question was unplanned. It wasn't on the calendar. It wasn't part of any strategy, but it was the one thing he was sure of at that moment. Sophie looked at him for a few seconds, then nodded softly. "Only if you're not busy." Ethan smiled, a smile he'd never shown in public, then stood, reaching for his phone. "Elena," he said as the assistant answered the call, "I'll cancel all my meetings tonight and have the car brought around." There was a pause on the other end. Elena had never heard his voice like that before, but she didn't ask. She only replied, "Yes, sir." Ethan hung up and turned to Sophie. "Let's go." She stood, slinging the lavender backpack over her shoulder, then followed him out of the restaurant and into the glass elevator descending through the lights of the city. As the elevator doors closed, the final reflection cast across the mirrored walls wasn't of Ethan Maddox, the millionaire CEO, but of a man holding the hand of a child, stepping into a chapter of life he never thought he'd have to write, the chapter of fatherhood. And from that moment on, the game had changed. San Francisco at night didn't fall silent like other cities. It breathed, it pulsed, it glowed through the windows of high-rise towers with a kind of light that made people think they were in paradise, when really, it was just a place where the lonely could hide their loneliness behind glass, behind million-dollar views and perfectly aligned shelves of rare wine. Ethan Maddox's black sedan turned off Embarcadero Avenue and swept through a private entrance leading into Maddox Tower. The penthouse floor had no number, only a biometric scanner and the fingerprint of its owner. Sophie sat quietly beside him the entire ride. She didn't speak, didn't look out the window like children seeing the city lights for the first time. She kept her gaze on her knees, her hands still clutching the worn strap of her backpack. Ethan glanced at her more than once, tempted to speak. About the glowing Bay Bridge, about the old ice cream shops that used to be famous, about the stray cat on the rooftop garden that the building manager swore no one owned, but was always there. But no words made it out. He didn't know where to start, because he never imagined this moment would exist. When the car stopped in the private garage, Ethan stepped out first and opened the door for Sophie. Her hand was small and cold, but steady, like someone used to walking alone. The elevator recognized his fingerprint with a soft ping and ascended to the top floor, accessible only to him. They stepped into a glass-walled space, bathed in gentle light, filtered through automated blinds programmed by the time of day. The apartment was nearly 4,000 square feet, with a dark-toned interior, walnut wood floors, recessed LED lighting, and abstract art on the walls that Ethan couldn't name. He only remembered that one of them had sold for nearly $700,000 at auction. But tonight, none of it could fill the widening space between two people under the same roof who didn't yet know how to call each other by name. Sophie stepped in slowly, like crossing into somewhere forbidden. She didn't gape, didn't widen her eyes like other kids might when faced with tall ceilings, mirrored panels, or marble countertops. She simply said something that tightened Ethan's chest. "This place doesn't look like it's made for kids." Ethan didn't know how to respond, because she was right. Everything here was built for CEOs, investors, and economic journalists, not for children. There was no corner soft enough for a kid to sit and draw, no splash of color, no low shelf lined with books small hands could reach. He led her down the hall to the bedroom wing. "You can use this room for now," he said, tapping the sensor switch. A warm golden light spread across a space designed in beige and cool gray. A queen-size bed, an oak desk, a single armchair, and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city's electric glow. "Looks more like a hotel room than a bedroom," Sophie remarked, standing at the threshold, not stepping in. Ethan turned back, suddenly unsure of himself. He'd never had to consider if a room was child-friendly. For him, rooms only needed to be functional, not soulful. But now he could see it. It was too big, too cold, too lacking in the simplest details. A stuffed animal, a scribbled drawing, a shelf just low enough for a child to reach. "If you want," Ethan said, his voice slower than usual. "I could have someone redecorate this room. Put in things that feel a little more fun." Sophie didn't answer. She simply nodded and stepped in, placing her backpack on the chair. She sat at the edge of the bed, bouncing slightly to test the softness. Then, unexpectedly, she asked, "Do you have a nightlight?" Ethan paused, then walked over to the bedside and turned on a ceramic lamp. "I do." She watched the light cast a gentle glow through the yellow silk shade, then gave a small nod. Mom said night lights are the only thing that keeps people from feeling empty when they wake up in the dark. Ethan swallowed. He stood there, watching her pull the blanket up to her chin, her eyes still open, gazing at the ceiling. "Do you want me to turn off the main light?" he asked, almost whispering. "Leave it on a little. Don't shut the door all the way." "Okay." Ethan turned off the ceiling lights, leaving only the soft amber of the lamp, then pulled the door nearly shut, leaving a sliver open. As he stepped away, he heard her whisper, "Good night, Mr. Maddox." He stopped at the doorway. He didn't know why, but that sentence made him feel farther away, even though he was standing closer than he'd ever been to a life he helped create. He turned back, not looking at her, but spoke just loud enough. "Good night, Sophie." Then he walked down the hall, back to a room that, for the first time in years, felt too large for one man. And in that moment, as the wind whispered against the glass and lights blinked from distant towers, Ethan Maddox, for the first time, asked himself, how does someone live their whole life in a perfect space and never realize it was never truly home? The wind from the San Francisco Bay slipped through microscopic seams between soundproof panes, carrying the distant hum of a city that never truly sleeps. Car horns below, a police helicopter circling far off, and a faint sound from the hallway, just loud enough to make Ethan Maddox open his eyes. He had been lying there for hours, but had never really slept. The ceiling was the same slate gray, unchanged, but the world inside him wasn't. When a soft creak came from the end of the hall, instinct, more than thought, made him rise. He didn't turn on the light. Bare feet moved silently across the cold wood floor, as though even he was afraid to shatter whatever fragile dream was unfolding in this apartment. The nightlight at the hallway's end still glowed. The guest room door was ajar. Inside, Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the oversized t-shirt he'd lent her, hair tousled over one shoulder, hands clutching something tightly. She didn't turn around, but hearing his footsteps, she whispered naturally, as if this were routine, "I couldn't sleep." Ethan said nothing. He entered the room and slowly sat on the far side of the bed, keeping enough distance not to frighten her, but not so much that he felt like a stranger. "Are you holding something?" he asked, eyes landing on her small hands, clenching an object like a charm. Sophie looked up, then opened her palm. It was a small photo, edges curled, slightly yellowed, but the face in it was unmistakable. Claire Monroe, the same eyes, the same smile, arms wrapped around a much younger Sophie, perhaps 3 or 4 years old. Ethan looked at the picture like someone had reopened a memory long buried. Claire's face hadn't changed much since he last saw her, but what struck him most was the peace in her gaze, as if, even alone, she had been enough to anchor an entire world. "Mom always kept this in her wallet," Sophie said quietly. "I found it when I was packing her things." Ethan didn't know what to say. Empty platitudes like, "I'm sorry," or "she was amazing," vanished before they could form. No word felt big enough. He just sat there, staring at the woman he once left behind, now clearer than ever through the eyes of a child he'd never held. "I miss her," Sophie whispered, her voice steady, yet heavy as stone. Ethan turned to her, and for once, his gaze betrayed the calm he was known for. "You won't forget her," he said, his voice rough from restraint. "I'll tell you what I remember, even if it's not much." She looked up, her eyes lit for a moment. "Did you ever love her?" The question hit without warning, yanking Ethan out of his business shell and stripping away the last of his practiced emotional distance. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the window, looking out to the city lights that shimmered like something distant and unreachable. "I used to think I didn't know how to love," he said slowly. "But your mother was the first person who made me question that." A long silence followed. Then Sophie nodded, as if that answer confirmed something she had always suspected. "Mom never talked about you," she said. "But I don't think she hated you. I think she was just sad." Ethan turned back, catching her gaze. In her eyes was the maturity of someone forced to grow up too fast, of nights without lullabies, of questions left unanswered, of lessons in silence that no child should ever have to learn. "Are you angry with me?" Ethan asked, unintentionally. Sophie hesitated, then shook her head. But I feel strange. I don't know if I should be happy I found you." Ethan let out a breath. It was the most honest answer he had heard in 10 years of board meetings. He looked at her, then placed his hand gently on her knee, not gripping, just resting there like a quiet promise. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can start from tonight." Sophie said nothing, but her gaze softened. She handed him the photo as if sharing something sacred. Ethan took it, his fingers trembling slightly. It was the first time he had touched a piece of memory he had abandoned, and yet it was still whole, still waiting. "Do you dream a lot?" Sophie asked suddenly. Ethan smiled faintly. "I don't sleep very deeply." "Then do you ever imagine a different life? One with Mom and me?" He didn't answer right away, but in his mind, a warm kitchen appeared, tiny footsteps, the scent of baked sweets, a piano playing in the afternoon light, like a wordless film. "Yes," he said, this time without pause. "Now I do." Sophie smiled, for the first time, a real smile, not polite, not forced, just the smile of a child who heard the thing she'd been waiting to hear for a very long time. "I'm hungry," she said quietly, grounding them both in the present. Ethan stood, then held out his hand. "Then how about we make pancakes at midnight?" She took his hand, and for the first time, those two hands, so different in size and story, interlocked like something long separated finally finding its match. In that moment, Ethan understood that sometimes what makes a man a father isn't blood. It's choosing to stay, even when no one demands it. Ethan Maddox's kitchen wasn't made for cooking. It was built for architectural photo shoots, for his PR assistant's curated Instagram posts, and for quick client drinks before contracts got signed in the meeting room behind the glass doors. Every detail in that kitchen, from the flawless oven to the built-in wine rack, said one thing: cooking didn't happen here. But that morning, everything changed. In the misty light of San Francisco, through fog-kissed windows, a little girl sat on a high stool at the marble bar, her hair slightly messy, wearing his oversized T-shirt, legs swinging like a metronome, syncing with the rising rhythm of Ethan's own heartbeat. Because for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he was cooking for someone other than himself. "Do you like pancakes?" he asked, opening the fridge and fumbling among ingredients he'd purchased but never touched. "I like anything that's not instant noodles," Sophie said coolly. Ethan chuckled. He realized he was being amused by an 8-year-old, something no investor report had ever done. As the pancake batter hit the hot skillet, the smell of butter filled the room, a scent that, for the first time, gave the designer kitchen the warmth of a home. Sophie tilted her head, watching. "Have you made this before?" "No," Ethan said, flipping the batter with clumsy motion. "But I watched a tutorial. I'm good at following instructions." "Mom didn't need instructions," Sophie said, her eyes drifting. She could tell just by smell if something was missing. I remember one time she accidentally poured salt into milk. We both laughed so hard. Ethan paused. He'd never seen Claire laugh like that. Never imagined her in a kitchen, in a loose tee, hair tied up, laughing out loud over a ruined recipe. To him, Claire had always been the quiet girl with knowing eyes, with a soft, tilted smile through a cafe window on a cold December day. He didn't know what kind of mother she became, but now it was clear. She had been better than anyone he'd ever known. "I miss her," Sophie whispered again. Ethan nodded. "So do I." He placed a warm pancake on her plate, then drizzled maple syrup in a spiral. "Do you want anything else?" "Dad," Sophie said, "I don't know how long I'll be here." Ethan froze. "What do you mean?" "I don't know if you're going to keep me, or if this is temporary," she said, holding her fork but not eating, "because I don't have anyone else, but I also don't want to be a burden." Something collapsed inside Ethan, not because she lied, but because she was too honest, honest enough to make a grown man ashamed for not having thought of it sooner. He pulled out a chair and sat, placing his hand on the table. "Sophie," he said, his voice low but firm, "you are not a burden. Not now, not ever. You're my daughter, and you'll stay here, as long as you want, as long as you need." Sophie looked at him. For the first time her eyes wavered. She didn't cry, but they glistened. "Really? Really?" Ethan replied. "And I won't let anyone take you away. This is your home, and if you want it to be, this is our new life." A moment of silence. Then Sophie lowered her head, pierced the first bite of pancake, and popped it into her mouth. "Tastes better than I expected." "Good." Ethan smiled, standing up, "because I think I accidentally doubled the batter." They both laughed. That sound echoed through an apartment built for silence and performance. Now for the first time alive with the one thing all the rich seek but can never buy, the peace that comes from someone truly needing you. When the doorbell rang, Ethan opened it. There stood Elena Rhodes, his personal assistant, never one to appear unannounced, always punctual to the second, always with her iPad and eyes that noticed everything. "Mr. Maddox," she said, hesitating as she peered inside. Her gaze landed on Sophie, who was now wiping her mouth with a napkin like she owned the place. "Elena," Ethan said calmly, "this is my daughter, Sophie." Elena took a beat to process that, but as a true professional she nodded, stepped in, and bent down slightly. "Hello, Sophie. I'm Elena, your father's assistant." "I thought assistants were older," Sophie said. Elena laughed for the first time in 12 years of working with Ethan. "People mistake me for a college student all the time." Ethan glanced at the clock. "Did you cancel all the morning meetings?" "Done. But there's a major session this afternoon on the new product line. It can't be moved." Ethan considered it for a moment, then turned to Sophie. "Would you like to come to the office with me this afternoon?" Sophie looked up. "Is it like in the movies? Glass offices, long tables, people dressed all serious?" "Exactly. Can I bring my sketchbook?" "Of course." Sophie stood. "Then I'll go, but you have to promise no one calls me temporary." Ethan looked at his daughter, a smile touching his lips. "I won't let anyone call you anything but Sophie Maddox, and you get to decide what that means." At that moment, for the first time, Ethan didn't just see a child in his apartment. He saw a future, a presence that couldn't be replaced, a reason to come home, not from duty, but from desire. And a quiet voice echoed inside him like the beginning of a whole new chapter. "Maybe, just maybe, I've finally started living for real." On the top floor of Maddox Tower, where no street sound could ever reach, Ethan Maddox looked at himself in the mirror and couldn't deny it. The man in the pale gray shirt and loosened tie wasn't the version of himself he used to know. Something had shifted. Not his appearance, not his status, but something deeper behind the eyes that used to be cold and controlled. Perhaps it was the presence of a small soul sitting in the living room, doodling a skyscraper next to a man with glasses and a little girl with curls, with one caption scribbled underneath, "My dad and me." Ethan looked at that drawing before heading out the door, reaching for Sophie with a sentence that still felt new on his lips. "No meetings today. Let's go out." The car carried them through the streets of San Francisco, not on a schedule drafted by his assistant. Ethan didn't turn on the radio. Sophie didn't ask where they were going. But when the car pulled up at the east gate of Golden Gate Park, her eyes lit up softly, as if she had already known where they were going. They stepped out together, walking along a stone-covered path. Ethan took off his coat and slung it over his shoulder. Sophie carried a sketchbook and 2 colored pencils, one red, one blue. "Have you ever been here before?" she asked. "No," Ethan replied, his eyes sweeping the tall trees bowing gently in the wind. This place always felt off-plan. "Then I think you missed out," Sophie said, then ran ahead with her arms spread like a little airplane. Ethan followed, keeping a distance, not to control her, but to see her more clearly, to see her in an open space unconfined by glass walls or leather chairs or high-end carpets. She was herself here, and that made him wonder, had he ever been like that as a child, before the weight of expectations and schedules swallowed him whole. Sophie stopped beside a stone bench under a flaming red maple tree, sat down, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw. Ethan sat next to her, leaning slightly, watching as she tilted her head and let the pencil move quickly, as if recording things was second nature. "What are you drawing?" "The park," she said. "But the park from my imagination. A place for cats, for people with no homes, for busy people learning how to breathe." Ethan froze at that phrase. "Busy people learning how to breathe?" "Yeah, like you." She didn't smile. She just said it, then kept drawing. Ethan looked down, his hand tightening slightly. He used to think life was about clear goals and measurable victories. But now, in front of him was a child who asked for nothing but his real presence. Not physical, but emotional. "Did you ever have a favorite park?" "No," Ethan answered truthfully. "I never allowed myself to have a favorite place." "Why not?" "Because I thought I'd have to leave it." Sophie nodded without judgment. "Do you still think that?" Ethan turned, meeting her gaze, clear, unblinking, waiting for an answer. "Now I think, if there's any place worth staying, it's beside you." Sophie didn't reply. She just added one more detail. 2 shadows sitting side by side on the stone bench, one tall, one small. "Do you think I could keep a cat?" The question came suddenly, but it didn't feel out of place. Ethan chuckled. Cats in penthouses tend to be independent. "So like you." Ethan shook his head. I'm learning how not to be. Mom used to say the best kind of grown-ups are the ones who know how to live alone, but don't like doing it. Ethan nodded, then sighed. Your mom always knew how to say things that made me think. And I make you do things, Sophie replied, smiling as she closed the sketchbook, stood up, and pulled his hand. Let's go. I see an ice cream truck up ahead. They walked on, her small hand gripping his larger one, like a perfect punctuation mark at the end of the most peaceful moment Ethan had ever known. Before, he used to think a perfect day was when stocks soared, when a startup acquisition went through, or when his keynote speech was quoted in Forbes. But today, a day without meetings, without plans, without any reason to be outside, except for the presence of an 8-year-old girl, became the one day he would remember forever. As the afternoon sun tilted, softening the golden sky, Sophie sat next to him on the grass, eating vanilla ice cream and glancing occasionally at dogs running free. Do you think I should get a cat or a dog? Dogs need to be walked. Cats like staying still. Which do you prefer? I just want something that won't leave me. Ethan couldn't answer, but he knew from that moment on he would never let Sophie feel that way again. And in a lath-covered park, next to a silver ice cream truck, where no one called him CEO or Maddox or speaker or chairman or founder, but simply Dad, he understood something that all his years of ambition never taught him. The lives that matter most aren't the ones he was meant to conquer. They're the ones he was meant to hold, with both hands. When they returned from the park, Sophie's white shoes were dusty with red soil, the cuffs of her jeans slightly rolled from running. A drop of melted vanilla still clung to her shirt. But her face was so radiant it seemed to brighten the pristine elevator of Maddox Tower. Ethan stood beside her, not checking his phone like he usually did. Instead, he looked down at the small hand holding his, feeling the warmth of it like proof that something he never believed possible had come true. That one day where he lived wouldn't just be a place to sleep, to work, or to entertain, but a real home. When the elevator doors opened, Sophie stepped out first, as if already familiar with the space. She took off her shoes, placed them neatly in the cabinet, and then ran toward the living room, where her morning sketch still lay unfinished on the glass table. Ethan followed, took off his coat, hung it up, then paused for a moment, watching a child lying on the floor, continuing a drawing of the park from her imagination, a world with no skyscrapers, no glass walls, no leather seats, just trees, flowers, and 2 people on a stone bench under a perfect sun. He walked into the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water, one for her, one for himself. When he handed it to Sophie, she looked up, thanked him politely like a tiny adult, then returned to coloring the leaves with a light green pencil. What do you think of today? Ethan asked, sitting in the chair beside her. Sophie looked up and tilted her head, her eyes bright. I think it was a good day. Not like getting a good grade or winning something. Just good in the regular way. Ethan smiled and nodded. So I did okay. You did something most grown-ups don't, Sophie said, setting her pencil down. You showed up. That sentence made Ethan sit upright, as though an invisible string had pulled tight around his heart. Because it was true. He had shown up, not just physically, but with attention, with time, with the choice to stay instead of escape. Dad, Sophie continued, can I ask something? Anything? If one day I call you Dad, how would you feel? Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at her, those brown eyes clear like rainwater, those small shoulders, those wax-stained hands still clutching the sketchbook. "I would feel," he said slowly, then smiled, like someone finally got my name right. Sophie smiled, said nothing else, and just turned back to her notebook. But Ethan knew that moment had been recorded, not in words, but in presence, as the sun began to set, casting a soft orange hue through the glass windows. The luxury apartment finally smelled of frozen pizza heating in the oven. A simple, humble smell, but one that made everything feel closer. Ethan opened a cabinet, grabbed plates, poured some orange juice, and played a little jazz. Not for ambiance, but because the house was starting to sound alive. "Do you think you'll sleep in your room tonight?" he asked, as they sat eating pizza on the sofa, watching an old animated film. Sophie took a bite, then shook her head. "I want to sleep on your chair, just one more night." Ethan nodded. "Then the chair is yours. And if I wake up first, can I make pancakes? As long as you don't burn the place down, yes." Sophie laughed, a real laugh, and that sound made Ethan vow he'd do everything to hear it every day. After she fell asleep on the chair, curled in a blanket he brought from the bedroom, Ethan sat for a while, his eyes never leaving her peaceful face. He thought of Claire, of the years she raised their daughter alone, of the times she might have picked up the phone but didn't call, of all the things he could never undo, and of all the things he still had a chance to build. As he stood, closed the curtains, dimmed the lights, and placed a glass of water beside her, he didn't feel like he was doing anything extraordinary. He just felt like a father, and for the first time in his life, that didn't make him feel out of control. It made him feel free. The next morning, when Ethan woke to the sound of a spoon tapping against a bowl in the kitchen, he didn't rush out of bed. He lay there, listening to Sophie humming a soft children's song, the sweet smell of butter and batter drifting through the hallway. And he understood that life, once defined by his need to control everything, had begun to shift, not with a sudden jolt, but with a rhythm as steady as the sound of small footsteps on hardwood floors, with mornings where someone else woke up before him, not to prepare for a meeting, but to make pancakes. And in that moment, Ethan knew he was no longer a man living alone in a perfect apartment. He was part of a family. Even if it was just the two of them, it was enough to turn any space into a home. 3 weeks had passed since Sophie Monroe walked into Orchid and Slate, right up to Ethan Maddox's table, and uttered 4 words that redefined everything he thought he knew about power. 3 weeks, which might be nothing to a CEO who measured success in quarters and stock value, but which were enough to restructure a life that had been untouched by intimacy for far too long. During those 3 weeks, Maddox Tower stopped being a fortress for investors, stopped being a monument to total control or a glittering banner for polished isolation, and became a place marked by quiet, unmistakable signs that someone now lived there. A pair of small pink shoes tucked by the door. A broken pencil was left on the dining table. A half-finished comic book on the couch. A watercolor painting taped to the fridge, where once only a laminated healthy meal plan from his nutritionist had been. During an executive board meeting at Maddox Innovations, Ethan arrived 5 minutes late for the first time in over a decade. When he walked in, he didn't apologize. He simply sat down, loosened his tie, unbuttoned his collar, placed his iPad on the table, and said, "I want us to dedicate our next foundation budget to a scholarship program for children who lost their parents due to untreated medical conditions." The room fell silent. No one asked why. Only Elena Rhodes, his assistant, looked up at him for a moment, then nodded and quietly opened a new file in the internal system, marking the initiative in yellow. That night, when Ethan returned home, he didn't go to his bedroom. He went to Sophie's first, checked the blanket, turned off the ceiling light, turned on the night lamp, and left the door cracked, slightly open. She was already asleep, but no longer curled up like the first few nights, no longer clutching her mother's photo like an anchor against the world. She lay relaxed, breathing evenly, her face calm, and under the warm amber light, Ethan felt something he had never experienced after any merger or acquisition. He felt needed, not for his skills, not for his assets, but for simply being there, and from then on everything adopted a new rhythm. Mornings had the sound of water running in the sink as Sophie tried to wash dishes. Afternoons brought messages filled with scribbled emojis sent from her iPad during the art class Elena had arranged. Evenings brought questions that made Ethan stop work just to think. Why does the sky turn pink at sunset? Or, do you think if Mom were still here, she'd like painting or gardening more? Each question taught Ethan how to listen again, not to find the right answer, but to fill the spaces time had carved open in her and in himself. One Friday afternoon, as the two of them brought home a newly adopted calico cat from the rescue center, a small creature named Luna, Sophie stepped into the elevator and said, "Now it really feels like home." Ethan asked, "It didn't before?" She shook her head. Before, it was just a place to stay. That sentence stopped him cold, because it was true, and because now he finally understood the difference between those two ideas. A place to stay can be complete, luxurious, and safe. But a home needs only one thing: the feeling of being loved and accepted, no matter who you are, where you come from, or how many broken pieces you carry. Sophie hadn't just given him a new role. She taught him how to be human again, how to let go of the pride he once thought was foundational, to replace it with something more fragile, but far stronger. A hug when no one is watching, a truth spoken when there are no microphones, a small promise like, "I'll be home before bedtime." And when Ethan once took Sophie to visit Claire's grave, the woman he had never been brave enough to hold on to, he stood for a long time before the simple stone, saying the things he never had the chance to when she was alive. That he didn't apologize for changing, because that's what she had hoped for. But he was sorry it took him so long to begin living as someone who didn't just achieve, but someone who could keep. Sophie laid a drawing at the grave, one she made for Claire's birthday, a picture of a mother, a daughter, and a man holding an umbrella with the word "home" written in shaky letters above. "She'd like it," she said. Ethan didn't answer. He was too busy trying not to cry, not from pain, but because happiness can take your breath away, too. That evening back at home, Ethan placed the old photo of Claire into a frame, set it in the center of his desk, next to Sophie's painting, next to a small notebook where he had started jotting down little quotes from his daughter that he didn't want to forget. And before going to bed, he looked around the apartment one more time, not to admire the architectural design, but to feel how life had begun to nest in every corner, in that space Every ink stain on the table, every laugh from the kitchen, every crookedly stuck stamp on the mail slot was a reminder that no one is born to be alone. Ethan Maddox had once been a millionaire who knew everything except how to open his heart. Now, he didn't need to open it anymore, because that door had been knocked on by Sophie, and he hadn't closed it again. This wasn't a story about bloodlines or responsibility. It was a story about choice, about how a man could build an empire, but only when he chose love could he learn how to build a home. And when Sophie, just before the lights went out, softly said, "Good night, Dad," Ethan knew that the greatest thing he'd ever accomplished was something no one could ever measure in numbers, and he would hold on to it for life. Some achievements don't go on plaques. Some victories aren't measured in boardrooms, contracts, or rising stock lines. And some moments, quiet, unannounced, unremarkable to the world, carry enough weight to change a person forever. Ethan Maddox was once a name synonymous with power, control, and walls of glass built to mute anything too human. Until one day, an 8-year-old girl with soft curls and unwavering eyes walked into his life, without a warning, without demands, carrying nothing but a quiet question. "Do you want to stay?" And he stayed, not because he had to, but because he chose to. This story isn't a fairy tale. It's real, woven with loss, with choice, with those fleeting moments we often overlook when life moves too fast. But it's also a gentle reminder. Sometimes, the greatest thing we'll ever do isn't conquer the world. It's learning how to cherish someone who simply asks us to be present. And sometimes, a home isn't defined by how many people are in it, but by one person brave enough to knock and another brave enough to open the door. If you've ever felt like you were moving too fast to remember why you started, pause, breathe, look around. Maybe, just maybe, a part of your life has been waiting all along to be called by its true name. And maybe what you need isn't more success, but someone to share a 2 a.m. pancake with, who calls you by the simplest, most powerful name of all, Dad. Thank you for staying through the end of this story. May these moments be your quiet gift after a long, loud day. And if you've ever found light in the smallest of things, don't forget to leave a comment, because maybe, just maybe, the next story is yours. Thank you for taking the time to watch this heartfelt story. If it moved you, made you pause, feel, and hope, then that's exactly why we tell stories like these. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Each video is a journey, a lesson, and perhaps a reflection of your own memories. We'll see you in the next story, where emotions speak louder than words, and the truth always finds its way.